A photograph lies on a kitchen table under the light of an overhead lamp. Its edges have gone slightly yellow with age, and the surface carries the particular flatness of old printed images, the kind that were processed at a drugstore counter and handed back in a paper envelope. Someone is leaning over it, tracing a finger slowly toward the background, past the family gathered in the foreground, past the bright castle behind them, toward a small figure standing near the outer edge of the frame. The figure is a boy. He is wearing a striped shirt. He is squinting slightly against the Florida sun, and he is not looking at the camera because the camera was not pointed at him. He was simply there, standing in the particular way that children stand when they are waiting for something, or for nothing, or for the afternoon to continue. The family in the foreground did not know him. They had never met him, and for a very long time, neither did the woman who is now tracing her finger toward him across the kitchen table. She knows him now. She has known him for years. He lives in the same house as the kitchen table and the overhead lamp, and the photograph came out of a box that had been sitting undisturbed on a shelf in her childhood bedroom since the early 1990s. That particular discovery, made by a couple in Canada sometime after they became romantically involved, has a quality that most stories do not. It is not a story about anything that happened between two people. It is a story about something that simply was, quietly and without announcement, long before anything happened at all. Both of them had been children at Walt Disney World during the same week in the early 1990s, brought there by separate families traveling from different places, and they had ended up in the same corner of the same park on the same afternoon and had been captured, quite by accident, in each other's family photographs. The boy near the edge of her family's picture, the girl somewhere in his. The castle stood behind both of them. The Florida sun fell on both of them in the same light, at the same angle, on the same afternoon, and then they each went home with their separate families and grew up into different people in different places, and eventually found each other again by the ordinary means that people use. And eventually someone opened a box of old photographs, and eventually a finger moved slowly toward the background of an image taken before either of them could have known there was anything to look for. There is something particular about the quality of attention required to notice a thing like that. The figure in the background is not obvious. Background figures in vacation photographs are never the point. They exist in the periphery of a moment that was being recorded for entirely different reasons, caught incidentally by a lens aimed at someone else, preserved without intention in the shallow depth of an afternoon. Finding one requires the specific combination of knowing what to look for and happening to be holding the right photograph. Both of those things, in the Canadian couple's case, eventually arrived together at the same kitchen table. The English seaside has a particular light in August. It comes in sideways across the water and catches the sand and the faces of children in a way that is slightly different from the light anywhere else, recognizable to anyone who has stood on a British beach in late summer and felt it. In an old photograph taken sometime in the early 1980s, that light falls across a wide beach where a family has gathered to pose for a snapshot. They are assembled in the foreground, the way families do, arranged by height and affection, squinting toward whoever is holding the camera. Behind them, the beach stretches wide and slightly pale, and in the shallow surf a few yards back, a small figure in a striped swimsuit is crouching over a tide pool. He is completely absorbed in whatever is in the pool. He does not know a photograph is being taken. He belongs to a different family entirely, one that is somewhere off to the side, out of the frame, perhaps also looking at tide pools, or eating sandwiches, or walking along the waterline. The woman in the foreground of that photograph was a child. The woman who found the photograph years later, was her mother. The boy crouching over the tide pool would eventually become the woman's husband, and the woman's mother found this out by the particular method of looking carefully at a holiday photograph she had taken decades earlier and recognizing the shape of a face she had come to know well in the intervening years. That story was reported widely in British newspapers, and it had the quality that such stories tend to have when they circulate, a warmth that is difficult to locate precisely, but that has something to do with the innocence of the original moment. The boy at the tide pool was not performing anything. The family posing in the foreground was not aware of him. The photograph was taken in the uncomplicated way that holiday photographs are taken, to record an afternoon that felt worth keeping, and what it ended up keeping was considerably more than anyone realized at the time. The mother found it in the careful, unhurried way that old photographs get found, going through an album, looking for something else, stopping on a page, and looking more closely than she had expected to. The particular thing about that discovery is that it had a witness. The mother was the one who recognized the face. She had had years to come to know that face in other contexts, in other lights, in other rooms, and when she saw it in the background of a photograph she had taken herself on a beach in the early 1980s, she recognized it the way anyone recognizes a familiar face, not with uncertainty, but with the specific small start of a person who has just seen something they were not expecting to see, where they were looking. University archives have a specific smell. Anyone who has spent time in a campus library knows it, something between paper and dust and the particular staleness of a room that keeps its temperature very steady. Digitization changed many things about those archives, but it did not change the photographs that got scanned into them, including the crowd shots published in student newspapers across several decades, including the images that captured large university events from above or from the side, the kind of wide-angle photographs in which individual faces are small and incidental and not particularly legible unless a reader knows exactly which face to look for. A couple, whose story circulated in a Reddit post sometime in the mid-2010s, had that experience. They had begun a relationship, and at some point in the way that couples do, they discovered that they had attended the same university. This is not unusual. Large universities send thousands of students through the same buildings and the same events over the same years, and the odds of two people having both attended the same institution are not particularly small, especially in regions where large universities function as regional centers. What was particular about this couple's situation was what happened when one of them began looking through a digitally archived edition of the campus newspaper from a year when both of them had been students there. The crowd shot was on one of the inside pages. It had been taken at a large university event, the kind of event that draws enough people that the photographer steps back to capture the scale of the gathering, producing an image in which individual faces are small and slightly blurred and identifiable mainly by context. The couple found themselves in the upper right corner. He was caught mid-laugh, his face turned slightly towards something off to the left of the frame. She was a few feet away, facing a different direction, part of a different cluster of people. They were not together. They had not yet met. The photograph recorded them as two separate people occupying the same crowded room, which is exactly what they were. There is something worth holding for a moment about what it means to be caught mid-laugh in a photograph and not know it for years. The laugh was real. The moment it captured was a real moment in a real afternoon, and he had no awareness of it afterward, no memory of a camera nearby, no reason to think anything about that particular laugh had been preserved. And then, years later, in a different room, in a different part of his life, He sat across a table with the person who would eventually show him what that afternoon had looked like from the outside. The laugh is still there in the photograph, still mid-moment, still aimed at whatever it was aimed at. Wedding photographs are a particular kind of archive. They are taken with a specific intentionality that most casual photographs do not have. A hired photographer, a structured set of images, careful attention to the main subjects, and yet they are also, almost by definition, full of people who are not the main subjects. Guests gather in arrangements that nobody planned. Backgrounds fill with figures holding their conversations, turning away from the lens at the wrong moment, standing near strangers in the way that people stand near strangers at the edge of a party. They are both attending for different reasons. A couple in New York discovered that they had both attended the same wedding approximately 4 years before the occasion of their meeting. They had been guests of different parties. One knew the bride, one knew the groom, or some equivalent arrangement that placed them in the same room through entirely separate social channels. They were captured in the background of a group photograph from the reception, standing within a few feet of each other, both turned slightly away, holding whatever conversations they were having with whoever they were with. Neither was paying attention to the other. There was no reason they would have been. They were strangers at a wedding, which is a very ordinary condition to be in. What makes that particular photograph different from any other wedding reception image is only what happened afterward. 4 years of afterward, to be specific. Somewhere in the space between that wedding and the day they met, their lives were rearranging themselves in the various ways that lives rearrange, and eventually those lives intersected, and eventually they became a couple, and eventually someone who had been at that wedding had a photograph from it, and eventually both of them looked at it at the same time and identified themselves in the background, standing within arm's reach of each other, suspended in a moment that belongs equally to both of them and that neither one remembers. The detail that stays is the arm's reach, not across the room, not at opposite ends of a venue that seats 200 people, within arm's reach in the background of a photograph at a party they were both attending for unrelated reasons, 4 years before they had any idea who the other person was. Around 2012, something changed in the way these stories circulated. The change was not in the stories themselves. Couples had been finding each other in old photographs for as long as there had been photographs, but in the technology available for sharing them. Social media platforms gave people a place to post side-by-side comparisons, an old photograph on one side, a more recent one on the other, the same two faces in both images, the first time as strangers and the second as partners. The posts spread through the particular mechanism that social media uses to spread things that carry a gentle emotional quality, which is to say they moved quickly and widely, shared by people who were not personally involved, but who found in the images something they wanted to pass along. By the latter half of the 2010s, the format had become recognizable enough to be called a trend. Tourist destinations appeared frequently, theme parks, famous landmarks, the kinds of places where families from different cities and different backgrounds are channeled into the same physical space by the same gravity that has always drawn people to significant or celebrated places. Large public events appeared, concerts, fairs, sporting events, the broad-acre gatherings of people who have no particular relationship with one another except their presence in the same field or stadium on the same afternoon. School functions appeared in which the incidental background figures of one family's photographs turned out, years later, to be the future partners of the children, posed carefully in the foreground. The posts varied in their precision. Some were well documented, with dates and locations confirmed, and faces clearly identifiable. Others relied on a resemblance that might have been coincidence rather than identity, and some commenters said so. But the posts that spread most widely were the ones where the case was clear, where the old photograph was dated, where the location was confirmed, where the face in the background was unmistakable. Those were the ones that people returned to, that circulated again when someone shared them a second or third time, that accumulated thousands of responses from people who found in them something recognizable without being able to say exactly what. What those posts had in common was not the coincidence itself. Exactly. Individual coincidences of the kind they documented are not particularly rare in the broad sense, given how many photographs are taken and how many people move through shared spaces, and how many of those people eventually form romantic relationships. What they had in common was the photograph as evidence. The photograph made the coincidence visible in a specific and verifiable way that a story told without one cannot be. It placed two people in the same frame before they knew each other, and the frame itself was the argument. Whatever the viewer felt upon seeing it was felt in response to actual light, fixed in actual silver or actual pixels, taken by an actual camera on an actual afternoon. The evidence was right there. That is what made the post different from stories told at dinner parties, and that is what made them spread. A couple stands near the entrance of a theme park in a photograph that their respective families took on different occasions. They did not know each other. Their families had driven there from different cities and were navigating the same park with the same maps, watching their children in the particular alert way that parents watch children in crowded places. A photographer hired to document guests at the park's entrance was doing what such photographers do, raising the camera, catching a moment, creating the kind of image that gets sold in a cardboard frame at the end of the day. And somewhere in the resulting image, if someone looked carefully enough and knew what to look for, both of them were there. The discovery of these images often follows a similar shape. Someone is going through old photographs for a specific and unrelated reason, preparing for a move, organizing an estate, digitizing film negatives that have been sitting in a shoebox for 20 years. They are not looking for anything in particular. They are simply doing the slow, quiet work of sorting, which is one of the ways that objects surface that have been submerged for years. And then something in a background catches their attention, or they mention to a partner that a certain photograph was taken at a certain place in a certain year, and the partner looks more carefully, and someone gets up to find the photograph in question, and eventually two people are standing over a kitchen table or sitting side by side in the blue light of a laptop screen, looking at a background figure who is now somehow the person beside them. The shape of the discovery has its own quiet rhythm, the initial looking, the gradual focus, the small specific moment of recognition, not the dramatic recognition of a film, but the quieter thing, the slight forward lean, the pointing finger, the sentence that begins with a word like wait, and then the pause while both people look at the same image together and understand what they are looking at, which is themselves, in a time when they were separate, in a place they both remember going to without any awareness of what else was happening in the frame. A beach, a castle, a campus hall, a wedding reception, an amusement park entrance. These are not unusual places. They are places that large numbers of people visit for reasons that make sense on their own terms, without any awareness of who else is there. The concentrating effect of popular destinations means that many pairs of people who will later know each other have already shared the same space, often more than once, without anything coming of it except the possibility that one of those shared moments was recorded by someone with a camera. Most shared moments are not recorded. Most photographs are taken with attention only to their foreground. And yet the archive exists. in boxes and albums and digitized files, and it is larger than it appears from the outside. A family takes a vacation. They take photographs. They bring the photographs home and put them in an album or a shoebox or a digital folder, and the album or shoebox or folder sits somewhere for years while the family continues to exist in forward time, attending other events and taking other photographs and building the particular accumulation of images that constitutes a life. The background figures in those photographs persist in the record without anyone looking at them specifically. They are held in the silver of the emulsion or the data of the file, patient in the way that stored things are patient, which is to say not patient at all, simply unchanged, simply still, simply continuing to be what they were when the light fell on them. Then someone opens a box. Not always for this reason, not usually for this reason. The box gets opened because someone is looking for a specific photograph of a grandmother, or because they want to show a child what their childhood looked like, or because they are moving and every object in a closet needs a decision made about it. The photograph in question is not on top. It is somewhere in the middle, or near the bottom, or tucked into a different envelope than expected. And when it surfaces the way objects surface from old boxes, with the mild surprise of something that had been forgotten and is now remembered. Not dramatically, just in the quiet way of a found thing. The background figure is not obvious at first. It takes a specific kind of looking to see the figure rather than the photograph. Most people look at a family vacation snapshot and see the family, the occasion, the light, the castle, or the beach, or the fairground ride that establishes the setting. The background is context rather than content. Moving past it, from the figure in the foreground to the striped shirt near the edge of the frame, requires something, a reason to look, a name mentioned in conversation, a story that makes the background suddenly worth examining. When the reason is present, the looking changes. The eye moves differently. The background becomes a place to search, rather than a field of visual information to be processed and ignored. And then the figure resolves. Not all at once, but in the particular way that faces resolve in old photographs when someone is looking for them. The moment when the arrangement of pixels or grains becomes a face, and the face becomes recognizable, and the recognition produces the small physical event of understanding something that was not understood before. The brain does this work quietly and quickly, and delivers its conclusion without much ceremony. The ceremony comes from the people standing over the photograph, who are not the brain, but the persons the brain belongs to, and who are now confronted with the fact of having been in the same place before they knew each other. Some of those couples describe the experience afterward as feeling, in some not quite articulable way, right? Not surprising in the way that random information is surprising, but right in the way of a thing that fits, that retroactively makes sense of something they had not known, needed to make sense of. Whether that feeling belongs to the coincidence or to the relationship that preceded the discovery, whether what feels right is the image or the life they were looking at it from, is not a question with an obvious answer. Both were true at the same time, in the same kitchen, under the same lamp. Some of these photographs were small enough to hold in one hand. The standard drugstore print of the film era was 4 inches by 6 inches, light enough to be held loosely between 2 fingers, small enough that the background figures were not easy to identify without assistance. Leaning closer helped. A magnifying glass helped more. In the years after digital scanning became widely accessible, photographs got enlarged on screens, and the background figures were examined under a zoom that the original print had never anticipated. This produced new discoveries. Images that had been sitting in albums for 30 years became searchable in a way that they had not been before, and some of them, when enlarged and examined, contained figures that matched faces that were now familiar. The digitization of old photographs introduced a different quality of attention to the family archive. A scanned image could be zoomed into its background, and the background enlarged on a monitor revealed detail that the 4x6 print had held but never offered to the unaided eye. The figures at the edge of a crowd shot, the child in the shallow surf, the person mid-laugh in the upper right corner of a room full of people. Under sufficient magnification, these figures became persons rather than background elements, and persons, when examined by someone with sufficient reason to look at them carefully, could sometimes be recognized. The recognition, when it came, was not always certain at first. Old photographs do not always provide unambiguous evidence. Lighting conditions, print quality, the angle of a face, all of these can produce a resemblance that is convincing without being definitive. Some couples looked at a background figure and felt the particular uncertainty of a near recognition, the sense that the face was familiar without being able to say with confidence that it was the right face. Zooming in helped, or sometimes made it worse, as pixels dissolved into uncertainty under high magnification. But in the clearest cases, the cases that circulated most widely in the mid-2010s and after, the recognition was not uncertain. The face in the background was the face of the person standing beside them, and both people could see it, and there was nothing complicated about the recognition itself, only about what it meant. What it means to have shared a frame before sharing a life is not a question that resolves into a single answer. The people who discovered these photographs did not all feel the same thing about them. Some found them delightful in a specific and contained way, a good story, a remarkable coincidence, something worth keeping. Others held the discovery a little differently, in a way that touched something in them that they were not entirely sure how to name, a sense that the photograph was not just a coincidence, but something more like evidence, though evidence of what exactly was harder to say. Most of them framed the image carefully and put it somewhere they could see it. The social media posts that accumulated from around 2012 onward were not always well sourced. Some were constructed from genuine discoveries. Some may have been assembled from separate photographs that happened to feature people of similar appearance, identified as the same person with more confidence than the visual evidence actually supported. The comment sections of those posts often included both believers and skeptics, and the conversation between them was part of what kept the posts circulating, not resolution, because there was rarely resolution, but the lively, warm, slightly contentious process of a group of strangers examining an old photograph and arguing about what they see in it. What stayed constant across those posts, regardless of their verifiability, was the desire to look. People zoomed in. People asked for higher resolution versions of the images. People compared faces with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely trying to establish something. There is something particular about the act of looking into the background of a photograph that belongs to another family, searching for a face that may or may not be there, and finding or thinking one finds a face that is now familiar. It requires a kind of attention that most photographs do not demand, a willingness to treat the background as the subject, to reverse the intended hierarchy of the image and find the content in what was supposed to be the frame. The corner of the world that held two children at a theme park in the early 1990s was not holding them for any particular reason. The park held thousands of children that week, as it held thousands every week, channeling them through the same attractions and the same plazas and the same photographic moments that the park's design made inevitable. The two of them happened to be near each other on a particular afternoon, and a camera happened to be pointed in their direction, and the resulting image happened to be kept rather than discarded, and the box it was kept in happened to survive the various moves and clearances that typically thin the photographic record of a childhood. Many things happened. All of them were ordinary. The cumulative result was a photograph lying on a kitchen table under an overhead lamp with a finger moving slowly toward the background. There is a shoebox on a shelf somewhere. It is not a particular shoebox, or rather it is a particular one for each family that has one. A box of photographs that were printed and held and put away, surviving the years in the particular low-key way of objects that are not essential but not discardable either, tucked into closets and attics and the upper shelves of spare bedrooms where they wait without any awareness of waiting. Inside that box, there are images of ordinary days. There are holidays and gatherings and afternoons that felt worth keeping, arranged in no particular order, slightly shuffled by whatever handling they have received over the years. There are foreground subjects posed or candid, and there are background figures who did not know they were being kept. The discovered photograph gets tucked back into the box when the looking is done. Not discarded, it has already demonstrated that it is worth keeping. Not framed, not yet, or perhaps eventually, but for now returned to the box in a slightly different position from where it was found, marked by the handling it has received, slightly warmer from the kitchen table light. The box goes back onto the shelf, and the shelf holds it as it has held it, and the other photographs in the box continue to exist undisturbed, each one holding its own ordinary afternoon, its own foreground and its own background, its own incidental figures, caught by a lens that was aimed at something else entirely. The archive is larger than it appears. Not every box has been opened. Not every background has been examined. Not every figure caught at the edge of a family photograph in a theme park in Florida, or on a beach in England, or at the back of a crowded university hall, or somewhere in the background of a wedding reception, has yet been found by the person who would recognize them. They persist in their various boxes, on their various shelves, in the particular patient stillness of stored things, holding the light of the afternoons that made them, unremarked and unhurried, waiting for the ordinary occasion that will bring someone to open the box and look. A subway platform at morning rush hour fills the way. Water fills a basin. Gradually, then all at once, the people arriving from the stairs and the turnstiles and the far end of the tunnel, until the space is dense with coats and briefcases, and the particular posture of people who have done this same thing so many times that their bodies carry it without effort. The same figures appear in roughly the same places every weekday. The woman with the red scarf who stands at the third pillar, the tall man who reads a folded newspaper with the patient concentration of someone for whom this has been a morning ritual for years, the pair of construction workers who always arrive together, hard hats tucked under their arms, talking steadily about something that requires no visible conclusion. No one has exchanged a word with any of the others. No names have been offered. And yet every regular commuter on that platform carries something, not a memory exactly, but the specific settled comfort of a face in its expected place. This is a form of knowing that the brain develops quietly, without being asked. It keeps no notes about the process. It makes no announcement when the process is complete. The red scarf woman simply becomes, over the weeks and months, someone whose absence on a given morning is faintly noticed, a small gap in the platform's familiar texture, the way a piece of furniture is noticed when it has been moved. None of this requires a conversation. None of it requires a name. The knowing happens before any of that, laid down in the brain's patient daily record of what belongs to a given place and time. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram gave this phenomenon a name in 1972 in a paper presenting research he and colleagues had conducted at the City University of New York. He called these figures familiar strangers, a phrase that sits slightly oddly at first, because the two words seem to resist each other. A stranger is, by ordinary definition, someone not known. Familiarity implies a kind of knowing. Milgram's finding was that these two states are not as incompatible as they appear, that there is a whole category of human relationship that lives in the space between them, real enough to be measured, specific enough to be named. In his research, commuters who encountered the same individuals repeatedly without speaking developed an unspoken mutual recognition that was distinct from true anonymity, a kind of acknowledged non-relationship, a shared understanding between two people that they were to each other a face that belonged in this place, without being anything more. The people in Milgram's study could identify their familiar strangers. They could point them out from photographs. They described mild discomfort at encountering these figures outside their usual context, at a grocery store, say, or at a party, a flicker of misplacement, as though the platform woman in the red scarf had appeared in a room where she had no business being. The context was part of the knowing. Take a familiar face out of its context, and what the brain has recorded becomes suddenly hard to place, like a word you know well that looks wrong when you stare at it too long. The knowing is real. The recognition is genuine. It simply has no name attached to it, and so it floats, available but unlabeled. There is, in fact, a great deal of this kind of floating knowledge inside a human brain at any given moment. The brain encodes faces with a diligence that the conscious mind rarely acknowledges. Deep in the temporal lobe, a structure that cognitive neuroscientists have spent decades studying, is dedicated almost exclusively to the work of processing faces, a region known as the fusiform face area. Though before the name, it is worth understanding what the thing actually does. It responds to faces the way other regions respond to their own specialties, the way the brain's spatial navigation cells respond to a change in position, or the way auditory processing regions respond to the onset of sound. Show a person a face, and this area activates. The activation is fast, largely automatic, and substantially more specific to faces than to other visual categories. The human brain has, apparently, given faces their own department. What the research on this region has revealed over the years is that the department keeps records in ways that its owner doesn't always know about. Neuroimaging studies have found that the fusiform face area shows measurable activation differences when a person sees a face they have been previously exposed to, even when that previous exposure happened without any conscious notice, and even when the person has no accessible memory of the encounter. The face of someone seen briefly at a party 3 years ago, never spoken to, never thought of since, that face, if it appears again in a laboratory setting, will produce a different pattern of neural response than a face that has never been encountered at all. The brain has the record. The person sitting in the scanner, looking at the image, has no idea where it came from. This is the part of the finding that takes a moment to settle. The record exists independently of the person's awareness of it. Two people can share the same train car for 6 months without speaking, and by the end of those 6 months, each of them is carrying a neural record of the other's face, a record that would show up as measurable activation on a brain scan, a record that quietly structures the mild ease one person feels in the other's vicinity, without either of them having any conscious access to the fact that such a record was ever made. The face is known. The knowing is simply buried under the threshold of what surfaces as remembering. This threshold is a real feature of memory, not a failure of it. The brain operates on multiple levels of encoding and retrieval, and the conscious, verbal, retrievable kind of memory that feels like remembering is only one of them. Below that level lies a whole layer of implicit memory, patterns and preferences, and recognitions that influence behavior and feeling without ever becoming the kind of thought that can be put into words. The fusiform record of a familiar face sits in this layer. It shapes how comfortable or uncomfortable a person feels in someone's presence, how quickly ease develops in a new interaction, how certain it is that this person belongs, without that certainty resolving into anything that can be explained at a dinner table. Robert Zajonc, a psychologist working at the University of Michigan, spent much of his career documenting the way this layer of implicit encoding shapes preference. His landmark 1968 study, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, set out to answer a question that seems almost too simple to require investigation. Does seeing something more often make you like it more? The experiment was careful and somewhat stripped down. Zajonc exposed participants to stimuli, Chinese characters, photographs of faces, abstract geometric shapes, varying only the frequency with which each was shown. Some images appeared many times, some appeared once, some appeared not at all. Then participants were asked to rate their preference across the full set. The result was consistent. The more frequently a stimulus had been shown, the more favorably it was rated. Not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, but reliably and repeatedly, the preference showed up across different kinds of stimuli, across different participant groups, across different experimental designs, as the research was extended over the years. Zajonc called this the mere exposure effect, and the name is accurate. The preference requires nothing more than exposure, no interaction, no conversation, no conscious processing of any depth. The face that has appeared before is liked better than the face that has not. The familiar is preferred over the novel, and the familiarity doesn't have to be consciously recognized for the preference to take effect. This has implications that go well beyond the laboratory setting. The commuter who stands near the same person every morning for a year is, by the logic of the mere exposure effect, quietly accumulating a positive orientation toward that person without any deliberate effort and without any awareness of what is being accumulated. The faces that have passed through a person's life and lodged in their implicit memory are not neutral to them. They are in some small but measurable degree preferred. Not known, not liked in the active sense of having chosen to like someone, but registered as something a little more welcome than a stranger, as something that belongs in the particular way that a familiar face on a familiar platform belongs, even when no word has passed between them. Zajonc's work has been extended and replicated in the decades since that 1968 paper, and one of its more interesting extensions involves the conditions under which the effect is strongest. It turns out that the mere exposure effect is more powerful, not less, when the prior exposure was brief enough or inattentive enough that it didn't produce conscious recognition. When people don't consciously remember having seen something before, their preference for it is stronger than when they do remember. The familiarity is felt without being understood, and that unfounded fondness, the warmth with no story behind it, is precisely the pattern that shows up in the effect's clearest demonstrations. The brain has done something, The person has no account of what it was or when it happened. There is a particular kind of experience that most people have had at some point and found difficult to describe afterward. It is the experience of meeting someone for the first time and having the specific, unplaceable sense that this has happened before. Not that you've met this particular person exactly, but that something about the meeting has a quality of return to it, a faint texture of recurrence without the specific memory that would explain it. This experience has a clinical name, déjà vu, from the French for already seen, and researchers who study it have found that its relationship to memory and familiarity is more interesting than the name implies. Cognitive psychologists, including Chris Moulon and Akira O'Connor, have contributed significantly to the research on déjà vu, and one of the things their work has established is that the experience arises from the brain's familiarity detection systems, a set of structures concentrated in the medial temporal lobe that are responsible for the sense of recognition, the feeling that something is known. These systems normally work in coordination with the brain's memory retrieval systems. Recognition fires, memory retrieval fires too, and the specific memory surfaces alongside the feeling that it is already known. But in the experience of déjà vu, this coordination breaks down in a particular way. Familiarity fires, memory retrieval does not. The sense of recognition arrives without its accompanying content, which leaves the person with the strong, persuasive feeling that something is familiar without any retrievable explanation for how or why. What Moulon, O'Connor, and others have found is that this is not simply a glitch in the system. The familiarity signal itself is real. It is generated by neural machinery that is responding to something. In some cases, what it is responding to is the structural similarity between the current experience and a previous one that was encoded below the threshold of conscious memory, a place that shares its geometry with somewhere visited years ago, a voice that carries the same rhythm as someone encountered once and forgotten, a face that belongs to a person the brain has seen somewhere in some crowded room and cataloged without reporting back. The familiarity is not manufactured. It is the surface expression of something the brain has actually held, even when the conscious mind has no access to what that thing was. In socially rich environments, parties, travel destinations, large university events, gatherings of any kind, the brain is encountering faces at a rate far exceeding what the conscious mind can process or retain. The surface of attention skims across the room, noting what it needs to note, registering what is salient, letting the rest pass. But the rest does not pass entirely. The fusiform face area continues its work in the background, encoding at the rate that visual input arrives. The platform fills and empties and fills again, and the brain keeps its quiet record of every figure that has stood in the same physical space. This is not an unusual capacity. It is not the mark of an exceptional memory. It is what a well-functioning human brain does, routinely, as a matter of its ordinary business. A study conducted in the 1970s by psychologists Harry Barrick, Phyllis Barrick, and Roy Whitlinger examined one specific and testable form of this long-term face encoding. They were interested in how well people could recognize former high school classmates from photographs and across how long a period this capacity endured. The participants in their study ranged from recent graduates to people who had left school 35 years earlier, and in every group participants were shown photographs of classmates alongside photographs of strangers and asked to identify which face they recognized. The accuracy rate, even among those who had graduated 35 years before the study, exceeded 90%. 35 years is a long time. The faces in those photographs had aged. The lighting and photographic quality were products of a much earlier technology, and the context, the school, the shared daily routine had been absent from participants' lives for decades, and still the recognition held. The brain had kept those faces across all of it, across careers and moves and marriages and the ordinary accumulation of decades, and could retrieve them with an accuracy that exceeded most people's intuitions about what long-term memory is capable of. The record wasn't simply stored, it was stored durably, in a form that remained accessible across the kind of time that changes almost everything else about a life. What this reveals is not just that memory is long, it is that face memory, specifically, is longer, and more reliable than many other categories of retained experience. The fusiform face area and the neural networks it is connected to appear to treat faces as a category worth keeping with particular care. This makes a certain evolutionary sense, given the extent to which human social life depends on the ability to know who is who across time and changing circumstance. But it also means that the archive of known faces that a person carries is considerably larger and older than they typically realize. Full of faces encountered in passing, in crowds, in the background of some other moment's attention, retained not because they were important then, but simply because the brain was doing what it does. The quiet work of that archive has a way of surfacing in unexpected directions. People sometimes describe a new acquaintance as feeling familiar in a way that has no obvious explanation, as though the relationship, even at its beginning, has already accumulated something. This feeling is usually dismissed as a romantic notion or a minor trick of perception. The research on face memory and the mere exposure effect suggests that it may sometimes be neither of those things. If two people have been in the same places, the same transit systems, the same neighborhoods, the same events, the same public spaces over the years, then by the time they are formally introduced, each of them may already be carrying a neural record of the other's face, along with the faint positive orientation that the mere exposure effect predicts. The introduction is new. The face, to some part of the brain that doesn't report its findings consciously, is not. This matters most for the way it accounts for something that is otherwise hard to explain. Why meeting certain people carries that particular quality of ease, the sense that the social distance has already been partially crossed before the conversation begins. It isn't always explicable as shared interests or chemistry in any conventional sense. Sometimes it is simply this: the brain's quiet recognition of a face it already holds, producing the warmth of the familiar without the story that would explain where the familiarity came from. The commuters on the subway platform have been building this kind of knowledge about each other for months. They have never spoken. They do not know each other's names, or occupations, or neighborhoods, or anything else that would ordinarily define an acquaintance. And yet, if a researcher were to place them inside a brain scanner and show them photographs of one another, the fusiform face area would light in the particular way that it lights for known faces, and the ratings they gave of one another's faces would carry the quiet, positive tilt that Zajong documented more than 50 years ago. This is the situation they are actually in, whether or not they know it. The knowledge has been accumulating alongside them without their permission or their awareness, stored in the neural real estate devoted to keeping track of who belongs in a particular world. Milgram noted something else about familiar strangers that has stayed with researchers in the decades since. He found that when two people who are familiar strangers to each other find themselves outside their usual context, at a party, in a different city, somewhere unexpected, They are significantly more likely to approach and speak to each other than two people who are fully unknown to each other. The familiarity that accumulated without words creates a small but measurable opening for words to begin. The absence of introduction has not apparently prevented the development of a bond thin enough to be called nothing but real enough to overcome the ordinary friction of talking to a stranger. The brain has already done some of the work. The conversation simply formalizes what the neural record has quietly established. There is something in this that speaks to the particular experience of the person who meets someone and finds them immediately easy to be around. The conversation that picks up speed without effort, the comfort that would ordinarily take weeks to develop arriving on the first afternoon. This can sometimes be explained by explicit shared experience, by overlapping backgrounds, by the ordinary machinery of finding things in common. But it can also be the result of a much older and more implicit process of two people who have been, without knowing it, slowly becoming familiar strangers to each other across the months or years before their names were exchanged. The fusiform face area has its records. The mere exposure effect has done its work. What feels like immediate connection may, in at least some cases, be the surface of something that has been building below the threshold of conscious awareness for a long time. The research on face memory and the familiar stranger phenomenon also offers a way of understanding something that people sometimes describe and rarely know how to account for: the experience of being certain, upon meeting someone, that the acquaintance has happened before, not as a mystical certainty, but as a specific perceptual impression, vivid and locatable, pointing towards some unretrievable occasion. The déjà vu machinery has already been described here, but there is a version of this experience that is more grounded, that arises not from a misfiring familiarity signal, but from a genuine prior encounter encoded too lightly to surface as a full memory, but persistently enough to generate recognition. The person is right. They have met before. They simply cannot find the meeting, because the meeting was brief and incidental, and the brain filed it below the level where deliberate retrieval can reach. What happens in cases like this when the meeting is eventually found? When someone recovers the context, a photograph, a shared acquaintance story, a memory that surfaces unexpectedly, the recognition that follows has a particular quality. It is the quality of finding, not discovering, of something settling into a place that had already been held open for it. The neural record was already there. What was missing was the story that connected the record to the person now sitting across the table. When the story arrives, the feeling is not surprise so much as confirmation. The quiet, grounded sense that the brain was right all along, that this face belonged somewhere, and now there is a name for where. Barrick's study of high school classmates returned to something that tends to resist easy summary. Across 35 years, across all the changes that decades produce in a face, the thickening or thinning, the color changing in the hair, the skin accumulating its history, the fundamental structure of the face remained accessible to the brain that had known it. The study found something that is easy to state, but worth sitting with, that the record a young brain makes of the faces around it may persist through the entire life that follows, available for recognition at the age of 50 or 60 or 70, waiting quietly in the neural architecture while the conscious life goes about its ordinary business of work and sleep and seasons and all the ordinary transactions of days. This is a long kind of keeping. The teenage face encountered daily in the particular way that school creates daily encounters is coded into the brain's face-specific long-term storage and held there across everything. The face changes. The storage holds the face anyway. updating along the way in ways that researchers are still working to fully characterize. The person who walked past in the school corridor in 1985, never known well, never much thought of afterward, may still be recognizable from a photograph at a reunion 40 years later, the brain threading the continuous identity through all the intervening change, offering the name before the conscious mind has fully registered why it is confident. The familiarity detection systems in the medial temporal lobe that generate déjà vu when they misfire are, under ordinary circumstances, doing something genuinely useful and genuinely impressive. They are running, constantly and rapidly, a comparison between current sensory experience and the stored record of past experience, and they are flagging the matches. Most of these matches are accurate. Most of the time, when something feels familiar, it is because it is familiar, because the brain has a real record of a prior encounter that the current experience resembles. The system is not infallible. Déjà vu demonstrates that it can generate false positives, but its baseline function is reliable, and what it is reliable at is finding faces that have been encountered before in the vast accumulated archive of a life spent among other people. A crowded platform at morning rush hour is, in this light, a different kind of place than it appears to the surface of attention. What looks like a gathering of strangers is also, for the regular commuters, a gathering of faces in various stages of being encoded and retained. The woman with the red scarf is already in the record. The man with the newspaper is already in the record. Every morning they stand there. The records deepen slightly. The implicit positive orientation that the mere exposure effect predicts grows slightly stronger, and none of it rises to the surface of conscious awareness or changes what anyone calls anyone else. The strangers remain strangers in name. In the brain's own accounting, they are something a little more specific than that, a category Milgram named 50 years ago, which still describes something that was always there to be named, waiting on every platform in every city where people share their mornings without knowing each other. There is a face, sometimes, that surfaces in a quiet moment without its context, a face that is recognizable in the way that something known is recognizable, but that carries no story, no name, no occasion that explains why the brain is offering it now. It simply arrives, clear enough to be seen, belonging somewhere that cannot be located. The brain is not generating this face from nothing. It is retrieving something it has genuinely kept, something that was deposited on a Tuesday morning years ago, or in the background of a party attended once and not much thought of since. The record is real. What is missing is only the story that would give it its proper place, and sometimes, in the quiet that follows such a moment, before the brain moves on to something else, there is just the faint, unhurried sense of all the faces that are held somewhere in the long architecture of a life's accumulated seeing, faces that were never introduced, that never quite became anything, that have simply persisted in the deep place where the brain keeps what it quietly decides to keep. A Kodak Brownie camera sat in a glass display case in a general store in the winter of 1900, small enough to rest in the palm of a hand, plainly made, finished in a dark leatherette that caught the light at its corners. The store clerk who demonstrated it to customers that February described it simply as a camera anyone could use. At $1, it was priced for a family that had never owned one, and most of the families who bought it that year had not. Before the Brownie arrived, portrait photography was largely a formal undertaking. People went to studios. They sat still on chairs in front of painted backdrops and waited while a professional managed the equipment and the light. The photographs that resulted were careful and arranged, almost ceremonial in their stillness, made on occasions that warranted the expense and the effort. The images that came back from those sessions were deliberate ones. Every person in the frame had been placed there or had placed themselves there with intention. The brownie changed the grammar of that entirely. It did not produce the finest images. The lens was small. The shutter mechanism was simple. The results were modest by the professional standards of the day. What it produced instead was something that no photographic technology had ever produced in such volume before: the casual photograph, the snapshot, the image made without ceremony on an ordinary afternoon of people who were not posing so much as simply being somewhere. George Eastman, the founder of the Eastman Kodak Company, had been working toward this kind of camera for years before the brownie was introduced. The name came from the brownie characters from popular children's illustrations of the period, small industrious creatures who got things done without fuss or notice. The name was apartment. The camera was designed to work without requiring much from the person holding it. It used a simple viewfinder, a fixed focus lens, and film that came in rolls, loading and advancing with a mechanism uncomplicated enough that a child could manage it. Many of the early advertising campaigns featured children using it, because that was part of the point. This was not an instrument for specialists. It was a tool for keeping ordinary days. Sales in the first year exceeded the company's projections considerably. By the end of 1900, more than 250,000 brownie cameras had been sold in the United States alone. Families bought them and brought them to birthday parties and summer outings and holidays at the shore. They brought them to state fairs and church gatherings and the kinds of Sunday afternoons that had previously passed without any record at all. The photograph album, which had existed before this moment but had been a somewhat formal object, began to change. It began to fill with informal images, crowded ones, outdoor ones, images where the subjects were not always centered and the backgrounds were not always considered. Those backgrounds are, in a way, the subject of everything that follows. When a person holding a brownie pointed it at their family on a beach in the summer of 1905, they were not thinking about the couple 10 feet behind them who had waded into their ankles, or the child at the edge of the frame who had stopped to look at something in the sand. They were thinking about the people they had come with, the faces they wanted to keep. The rest of the image was incidental. It was the world the intended photograph happened to be sitting inside of on that particular afternoon, and its presence in the frame was accidental and complete. This is how the archive of unintentional portraiture was built, not in a single decision, not by any photographer who set out to document the strangers in the background, but by the accumulated effect of millions of casual photographs taken over the course of a century by people who were focused entirely on someone else. Every family snapshot made on a beach, or at a fair, or in front of a landmark, carried in its margins the ambient presence of whoever else happened to be there. Most of those peripheral figures were never examined. They did not need to be. They were not the point. The rolls of film that came back from the developer were reviewed for the faces the photographer knew. If those faces were clear and well lit and recognizable, the photograph was a success. What happened in the background was secondary at best. The photographs were sorted and dated, or not dated, which would later become its own kind of problem, and placed in albums, or more often, into shoeboxes and drawers, and the kinds of containers that hold things no one has decided what to do with yet. They waited there in their millions across the decades of the 20th century, holding everything they had captured, including the things no one had meant to capture. The film itself was the first form of this patience. Photographic film works through a process of chemical reaction. Silver halide crystals suspended in a gelatin layer respond to light by undergoing a change at the atomic level, their silver ions reducing to metallic silver in proportion to the light that strikes them. The exposed film is then treated with developer chemicals that amplify those microscopic changes into a visible image and fixed with additional chemicals that stabilize the result against further light exposure. The final print is a physical record made of actual light-altered silver of what was present in front of the lens at the moment the shutter opened. There is something worth holding for a moment in that description. The photograph is not a representation of a scene in the way a painting is a representation. It is, in a fairly direct physical sense, a product of the scene itself. Light bounced from an actual surface through an actual lens and produced an actual chemical change in actual silver. The stranger in the background of a 1974 beach photograph is there because light that was reflecting off his actual face passed through the camera's aperture and altered silver crystals in a specific geometric pattern that preserved his position in the frame. He has been there ever since, in the silver, in the light. Family photograph albums created during the full span of film photography, roughly from the 1900s through the 1990s, are dense with this kind of unexamined detail, because the photographers making these images were focused on their subjects. The incidental figures in the background received neither attention nor exclusion. They were simply present in the world the lens was aimed at, and so they were kept. A crowd at a parade might hold 100 figures beyond the family members in the foreground. A fairground snapshot might carry the faces of strangers in a dozen stalls and doorways, stretching back into the depth of the image. An amusement park photograph from the 1960s or 1970s might include in the background a queue of visitors waiting for a ride, their faces small but legible, their presence in the frame entirely a matter of geography. The albums held all of this, year after year, in drawers and attic boxes and the lower shelves of bookcases, growing slightly yellow at the edges of the prints, the colors in older photographs shifting toward the warm end of the spectrum as certain dyes faded and others persisted. They were consulted on specific occasions, when someone wanted to show a grandchild an old image, when a family gathering brought out the impulse to look back. Between those occasions, they were simply present, holding their contents without actively presenting them. It was the act of looking closely that the archive always required, and it rarely received it. Professional photographers at large public venues had, from at least the 1970s, been creating a somewhat different kind of archive, one made commercially rather than personally, but carrying the same fundamental property of documented co-presence. Major theme parks, including the Disney parks in California and Florida, employed roaming photographers as part of their visitor experience. These photographers moved through the park throughout the operating day, offering families the service of a souvenir image in front of popular attractions. The photographs they made were pointed at their contracted subjects, the families who had agreed to be photographed, but the visual field those families were standing in was populated by hundreds of other visitors at any given moment. The roving photographer who raised a camera toward a family near the entrance of an attraction in the early 1980s produced a commercial souvenir image sold to the family in the frame. What the image also contained, in the queue stretching back into the frame, in the clusters of visitors waiting at the edge of the path, in the background of the attraction's facade, was a cross-section of everyone else who had been nearby at that specific moment. These images were printed and sold and taken home in their millions, tucked into the same albums and shoeboxes and drawers as the family snapshots. They contained, without anyone marking it, a record of who else had been there. The park photographers' archives were not the only ones of this kind. State fairs, seaside resorts, national parks, and large public events of all sorts generated photographic records throughout the 20th century in which the primary subjects were surrounded by incidental crowds. And school photographs, the long rows of children arranged by grade level, photographed every autumn, created a different kind of record, one that was more systematically organized, but carried the same fundamental quality of documenting co-presence across time. Two children in a school photograph from 1972 were there because they were in the same grade at the same school at the same time. Whether either of them ever noticed the other, whether either of them ever spoke, the image kept them both. The transition from film to digital photography began gradually in the mid-1990s and accelerated substantially through the early 2000s as the cost of digital sensors fell and the quality of consumer digital cameras improved. By the latter half of the first decade of the 2000s, digital cameras had become the dominant consumer technology for casual photography, and within a few more years, the integration of cameras into mobile phones had effectively placed a camera in nearly every pocket, available at every moment, and producing images at a volume that the film era could not have anticipated. The images produced by this new technology carried a new kind of information inside them. Embedded within every digital photograph is a layer of data invisible to the person looking at the image, a technical record written in a standardized format that travels with the photograph wherever it goes. This standard, known as EXIF data, was developed and formalized by the Japan Electronic Industries Development Association in 1995. EXIF stands for Exchangeable Image File Format. It is, in practical terms, a structured log attached to the image file itself, documenting the conditions under which the photograph was made. The camera model is recorded, the focal length of the lens, the aperture setting, the shutter speed, the ISO sensitivity. All of these are captured automatically at the moment of exposure and written into the file. The date and time of capture are recorded, drawn from the camera's internal clock. On devices with GPS capability, which came to include the great majority of smartphones from the late 2000s onward, the geographic coordinates of the device at the moment of capture are recorded as well, latitude and longitude, often with enough precision to identify not merely a general neighborhood or venue, but a specific location within it. A digital photograph taken at a theme park in 2009 on a GPS-enabled device carries within its file the exact moment of capture and the exact coordinates of the location. Open the file's properties on a laptop, and the EXIF data populates a sidebar: the date, the time to the second, the camera make and model, and two numbers that, entered into any mapping application, resolve to a specific point on a satellite image of the Earth, a corner of a specific path, in front of a specific attraction, on a specific afternoon. The image and its metadata together constitute a form of documentation that earlier photography simply could not provide. A claim about when a photograph was taken and where can now be examined against the file itself. This matters considerably for the kinds of discoveries that emerge when people realize they share an old photograph. In the era of film, the date of a family holiday snapshot was often approximate. The year could usually be determined, the month sometimes, the exact date rarely. The location could be identified from context or written on the back by someone who remembered to do so, but the record was informal and dependent on human memory. With digital photographs, the gap between the image and its documentation has effectively closed. The photograph knows when it was made, and increasingly, where. The precision available through EXIF metadata made it possible to do something that would have been nearly impossible in the film era: to verify with documentary evidence rather than recollection that two specific people were in the same specific location at the same specific time before they had any knowledge of each other's existence. A couple who discovers an old digital photograph containing both of them can, if the device settings were accurate, determine not merely that they were both at the same event or the same venue, but that they were both there on the same afternoon and within a specific number of feet of each other. Google Photos, which launched publicly in May of 2015, brought a different kind of capability to the same archive. Where EXIF data provides a precise record of when and where an image was made, the facial recognition system built into Google Photos operates on the content of the image itself, specifically on the faces it contains. The system works by mapping the geometry of a face across a set of landmark points, the positions of the eyes relative to each other, the distance from the eyes to the nose, the proportions of the jawline, the contour of the brow. These measurements, taken together, produce a geometric signature that is relatively stable across changes in age, lighting, and expression. The algorithm compares this signature against the signatures of faces it has seen elsewhere in the same account's photograph collection, and groups images that appear to contain the same face, regardless of when those images were taken or whether the person's appearance has changed substantially across the years between them. The result for anyone with a large collection of personal photographs is a kind of automated survey of the archive. The system threads a continuous identity through decades of changing haircuts and lighting conditions, pulling together images from different years and different contexts and presenting them as a coherent sequence. A face photographed at age 7, at age 22, and at age 40 occupies three very different images, but the geometric relationship between the landmarks of that face carries sufficient consistency across those years that the algorithm recognizes all three as the same person. Where this becomes especially relevant to pre-meeting photographs is in the system's indifference to the intended subject of the image. The algorithm does not distinguish between the person the photographer was focused on and the person in the background, 3 steps to the left. It maps every legible face in the frame. A background figure who appears in a family snapshot as a small, slightly out-of-focus presence is still a face, still a geometry of landmarks, and if that geometry appears elsewhere in the collection, the system will find the correspondence. People examining old photographs with this kind of tool, or simply with careful attention and a zoomed-in view on a high-resolution screen, began to make discoveries that would not have been available to them in the era of small prints held at arm's length. The resolution of modern digital cameras, even modest consumer ones, preserves enough detail in a background figure for recognition to be possible where it was not before. A face that appeared as a blur in a 4x6 print from a drugstore developer resolves on a retina display screen at maximum zoom into a recognizable person. The archive always contained these faces. What changed was the resolution of the tools brought to examine it. There is something characteristic about the moment of discovery when it happens in this context. The image is on a screen rather than in a hand. The photograph has been enlarged beyond the proportions it would ever have been seen in during the film era. Someone is leaning toward the screen, tracing a cursor toward a corner of the image, enlarging it again, looking at a pixelated face with the particular intensity of someone trying to confirm what they think they are seeing. The face, when it resolves, is familiar, not as a stranger found in an old photograph, but as someone known, someone present in the current life of the person looking at the screen. The archival photograph, the image that was made without any awareness of this specific figure in its background, becomes suddenly an object of a different kind. It is no longer merely a record of a holiday or an event. It is a piece of evidence about the geography of two lives before those lives intersected, a document of proximity, predating knowledge, the kind of document that the family standing in the foreground had no intention of creating when they asked the roving park photographer to take their picture. The photograph was always holding this. It was holding it in the silver or in the pixel values for however many years elapsed between the moment of capture and the moment of recognition. The information was present from the beginning. The discovery was simply a matter of knowing where to look and having the resolution to look there. The transition from the Brownie's modest lens to the multi-megapixel sensor in a contemporary smartphone represents something close to a century of incremental improvement in the fundamental task of preserving what was in front of the lens. Each generation of consumer photographic technology kept more information per image, made the images more durable, made them easier to store and retrieve and examine. The chemical processes of film photography kept images for decades with minimal degradation under reasonable storage conditions. Digital files stored on redundant systems can be kept indefinitely without any degradation at all. This accumulation of archival capacity had a quiet effect on the kinds of comparisons that became possible. A family that photographed every holiday through the film era of the 1960s, 1970s, and continued photographing through the digital transition of the 1990s and 2000s holds in its archive an unbroken record of presence in shared spaces across more than half a century. The images from the early decades may be smaller in resolution and warmer in color. The images from later decades are sharper and more precisely dated. Together, they constitute a record that no single photograph could approximate, a long view of two lives' worth of being in the world. And this is, in a practical sense, the condition that makes the kind of discovery possible in which a couple finds themselves together in a photograph. Neither of them remembers. It requires a sufficient archive on both sides. It requires that the images were kept rather than discarded. It requires that the photographs be examined with enough attention to notice a background figure and enough resolution to recognize one. All of these conditions became progressively more available to more people across the latter decades of the 20th century and the opening decades of the 21st, not through any single change, but through the accumulation of many small ones. The Brownie made it possible for ordinary households to build the kind of archive that had previously been available only to the formally documented. Digital photography made that archive precise and searchable. The cameras and smartphones that came to replace the Brownie were, in this sense, completing something that the Brownie had begun, the project of giving ordinary people the tools to keep their days. What was kept in the keeping was more than anyone intended. Some of the most striking examples of pre-meeting photographs have emerged specifically from the archives of large tourist destinations, and the Disney parks are among the most frequently cited locations in these discoveries, partly because of the scale of their visitor records, and partly because of the commercial photography infrastructure those parks maintained for decades. The roving park photographers who worked Walt Disney World and Disneyland from the 1970s onward were not creating a database of visitor co-presence in any planned sense. They were providing a commercial service and generating revenue. The archive they created was incidental to that purpose, but the archive was real and it was extensive. A roving photographer at Walt Disney World on a summer afternoon in the early 1980s might make dozens or hundreds of exposures across the day, each one pointed at a different family, each one containing a different slice of the background crowd. The families who purchased their photographs took home their souvenir prints. The background figures in those prints took home nothing, and in most cases had no idea they had been photographed at all. Neither party would have had any reason to consider at that moment what the other's image was carrying. Decades later, some of those images surfaced in the context of precisely the kind of discovery they had unknowingly documented. A couple comparing childhood photographs realizes that the background of one image contains the face of the person standing at the edge of the frame in the other. The location, identified from context, is the same. The year, identified from the ages of the children in the foreground, is approximately the same. The visit may have been the same week. The archive kept this fact for however long it took anyone to look. Photography at state fairs and seaside resorts operated along similar lines, though the archives generated there were less commercially organized and more scattered. Photographers at these venues, some professional, some simply the families themselves, produced enormous quantities of images over the decades in which film photography was the dominant technology. The seaside resorts of England, in particular, were photographed extensively across the middle and latter portions of the 20th century, first by professional photographers who sold prints to holidaymakers, and later by families with their own cameras. The resulting archive is distributed across private homes, local archives, and the kinds of commercial collections that have been partially digitized and partially not. It is in these archives that the earliest dated examples of pre-meeting photographs tend to be found because they precede the digital transition and were made entirely on film. The images are warm in tone, slightly soft in focus, populated with the clothing and postures of specific decades. Finding a face in the background of one of these images requires looking at a physical print under good light, or at a scanned version at sufficient resolution, with the patience to examine what the photographer was not examining when the shutter opened. A researcher who opens the properties window of a digital photograph and reads the EXIF data in the sidebar is performing a very compressed version of the same act of close attention. Both involve bringing the analytical faculty to bear on an image that was not made for analysis. Both produce, in their different ways, information about proximity, information that was present in the image from the moment of capture, waiting for the moment it became relevant to know. There is something in the technology of photography, taken across its full history from the Brownie forward, that has always been in the business of keeping more than was asked of it. The photographer pointed the lens at someone. The lens kept everything in its field of view. These were not the same instruction, and the gap between them is where the archive of unintentional documentation lives. The same gap exists in the modern version of the technology, though it is expressed differently. A smartphone camera captures in a single photograph a quantity of information that would have required a studio's worth of equipment to approximate in 1900. The sensor maps hundreds of thousands of distinct points of light in the scene, each one assigned a precise color value, the aggregate resolving into an image of sufficient resolution to be examined at considerable magnification without losing its essential legibility. The faces in the background of a modern photograph are not blurs, as they might have been in an equivalent image made on a first-generation Brownie. They are people. They have recognizable features, readable expressions, details of clothing and posture that carry information about the specific moment they were captured. The EXIF timestamp on that image records, to the second, when those features were present in front of that lens, and if the device's GPS was active, it records where these two data points together, identity and location in time and space, constitute the kind of documentation that makes proximity provable rather than merely arguable. When a couple finds a digital photograph from 5 or 10 years before they met, and the EXIF data confirms the date and the coordinates confirm the location, the discovery moves from the register of a remarkable story into the register of something documented. The technology did not set out to create this capability. The standardization of EXIF data was driven by engineering needs, interoperability between camera manufacturers, consistency in how image files communicated their technical parameters to see plicut etic. GPS embedding in cameras was driven by the consumer desire to map photographs to locations. Facial recognition algorithms were developed for a range of applications that had nothing directly to do with romantic history. The convergence of these capabilities into a single tool, a smartphone with a camera, GPS, and access to cloud-based photo management with facial recognition, is a product of accumulation rather than design. The result of that accumulation is a photographic archive of a scope and precision that the store clerk demonstrating the brownie in February of 1900 could not have imagined, and a set of tools for examining that archive that would have been equally remote from anything available at the time. The $1 camera in the glass display case and the smartphone resting on a table 120 years later are connected by the same underlying project, keeping images of days for people who want to hold on to them. What those images hold and what the tools available to examine them continue to reveal is still being discovered. The archive grows continuously. The faces accumulate in it, background by background, frame by frame, time-stamped and geolocated, and held in the patient keeping of formats designed to last. A photograph taken today will carry its EXIF data for as long as the file is preserved. The face in the background of a family snapshot made at a park on an ordinary afternoon will be there in the pixel values available to whatever examination time and attention eventually bring to it. The photograph does not know it is keeping this face. It is not keeping it for any purpose. It is simply the nature of the technology to record what is present in the field of view, without selecting, without omitting, without deciding that the background figures are not the point. The brownie began this indiscriminate keeping in 1900 in its modest way, with its fixed focus lens and its simple mechanism, in the hands of families who wanted images of their days. The tools changed across the century that followed. The resolution improved, the archives became more searchable, the metadata became more precise. The fundamental act remained the same. Someone pointed a camera at someone they cared about, and the world those people were standing in was kept along with them. Somewhere in that kept world, in an image that has been sitting in a file, or a shoebox, or a cloud storage account for years, a face is waiting in the background, small, slightly out of focus, looking somewhere other than the lens, belonging to a different family entirely. The photograph carries it with the same equanimity it carries everything else in the frame. The timestamp in the corner is accurate. The coordinates, if the device recorded them, are correct. The image has held all of this since the moment the shutter opened, with no knowledge of what it means, and no opinion about when the time to look might come. The smartphone rests on the table, its screen still lit, the photograph still open, the EXIF data still visible in the properties sidebar. A date, a time, a camera model, and two small numbers that mark a specific place on the surface of the Earth on a specific afternoon in a specific year. The numbers are precise and quiet. They carry inside them more than the eye sees in the image itself, more than the photographer knew was being recorded, more than the background figure in the frame had any reason to consider. The technology holds it all with equal patience, waiting in the steady, unhurried way of things that have simply been doing their work all along. An animated map of a city at midday fills a large screen. Thousands of points of light move through it, each one tracing the path of a single person. And from a distance, the effect is something like watching a tide, a slow, directed drift along the same corridors and crossings, channeled by streets and transit lines into patterns that repeat every weekday with small variations. The city's population arranging itself into familiar shapes without anyone directing it to do so. Two of those points, somewhere in the middle of the map, cross through the same intersection on a Tuesday morning. They pass within a few feet of each other. Neither one slows. The map records it and moves on. This is not a remarkable event on the map. It happens thousands of times in every 5-minute window. What makes it worth pausing over is not the crossing itself, but the quiet arithmetic that produced it, the specific mathematics of how many times two people, who will eventually find each other, must first have occupied the same small patch of the world without knowing it, moving through their separate days, going about their entirely ordinary business, the city quietly accumulating what neither of them is keeping track of. The numbers, when examined carefully, are not what most people would expect. Studies analyzing anonymized mobility data from cities including New York, Tokyo, and London have produced a consistent finding that takes a moment to settle. Two randomly selected residents of the same city, given the channeling effects of transit systems, commercial districts, and shared recreational spaces, can expect to pass through the same geographic zone on dozens or even hundreds of occasions in a single year. Not the same block necessarily, not the same platform at the same moment, but the same zone, the same quarter-mile radius around a coffee shop, a transit hub, a park entrance, a market, on a frequency that most people, thinking about the size of a city, would not intuitively arrive at. The city is large. The corridors through which it moves are not. This is not a law of physics. It is something simpler and in some ways more interesting. Cities do not spread people evenly through space. They pull people into shared channels, the same platforms at the same hours, the same lunch blocks, the same Saturday morning routes, through the same neighborhoods. Two people with no connection to each other, drawn by entirely separate routines toward the same type of place, will find themselves in the same type of place at the same type of time with a regularity that looks from the outside like something other than coincidence, even though it is exactly that. The regularity has a shape. It follows the contours of the city itself. There is a classic exercise in probability theory that demonstrates something related, and it has the quality of feeling wrong the first time it is presented, and then slowly, as the reasoning settles in, of feeling not just correct, but obvious. A statistics professor writes the number 23 on a whiteboard, below it a 50% sign. The claim is this: in a room containing 23 randomly selected people, the probability that at least two of them share a birthday exceeds 50%. For most people, the intuition runs in the other direction. There are 365 days in a year, 23 people. The chances seem low. The intuition is wrong, and the reason it is wrong is the same reason that pre-meeting coincidences are more common than they feel. The question is not whether any specific person in the room shares a birthday with any other specific person. The question is whether any pair, out of all the possible pairs in the room, produces a match. In a room of 23 people, there are 253 distinct pairs. The number of possible connections grows much faster than the number of people generating them. Each new person added to the room does not add one new potential match. They add as many new potential matches as there are people already present. The same arithmetic applies to cities. Two people living in the same urban area are not one potential connection to each other. They are nodes in a network of thousands of connections. The transit stops they use, the coffee shops they frequent, the neighborhoods they pass through, the events they attend, the parks where they spend Sunday mornings. Every place either person visits is a place the other might also visit, and the probability of their paths crossing, calculated across all those places over all the weeks of a year, is not the probability of a single matching birthday. It is the probability that out of 253 pairs, at least one matches. The number arrives at 50%, much sooner than the room full of 23 people expects. The professor circles the number and turns to face the class with the expression of someone who has presented this result many times and still finds it, each time, genuinely worth presenting. Carl Jung, working in a quieter register entirely, arrived at related territory from a different direction. His consulting room in Küsnacht, Switzerland, is described in his own memoirs as a still study overlooking Lake Zurich, a room suited for the careful, patient work of listening to what people brought him from their interior lives. On an afternoon he would later write down and return to often, a patient was describing a dream. In the dream, a golden scarab had appeared, a gilded insect, ancient symbol of transformation in Egyptian mythology, carrying the particular weight that certain dream images carry when they arrive with an intensity that outlasts the dreaming. As the patient spoke, something landed on the window behind Jung's chair. He reached back and opened the casement. What came through was a beetle of the species Setonia aurata, the rose chafer, the closest thing to a golden scarab that temperate European entomology could produce, arriving at the window of a Swiss psychiatrist. At the precise moment his patient was describing a dream of one. Jung did not offer a causal explanation for this. The beetle had not read the patient's dream. The patient had not summoned the beetle. What Jung described instead was a different kind of connection, not cause and effect, but simultaneous meaning. Two events arriving at the same moment, linked not by one producing the other, but by what their coincidence signified to the person experiencing it. He published his thinking on this in 1952 in an essay that laid out what he called synchronicity. The definition he gave it was precise and, on first reading, careful. The meaningful coincidence of two or more events connected not by cause and effect, but by their simultaneous occurrence and their shared significance to the observer. He was not proposing a mechanism. He was naming a category, the class of coincidences that feel to the person at the center of them like something other than chance, not because the mathematics are different, but because the meaning of the conjunction exceeds what arithmetic alone can address. The beetle came, the dream was being told. The patient felt it as something. That feeling, Jung argued, was real, even if its explanation was not within what causal science could reach. The two things are not in conflict, exactly. The probability framework and the experiential framework are addressing different questions. One asks how often two people who will later meet might be expected to have previously occupied the same space. The other asks what it feels like to a specific person in a specific moment to discover that they have. Both questions are worth asking. They do not cancel each other. There is a letter somewhere in Nebraska that begins a journey it has not yet started. The experiment that produced that letter was designed by Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist at Harvard who had spent years thinking about the structure of social networks and the question of how closely connected, in terms of mutual acquaintance, any two arbitrarily selected people in a large country might actually be. In 1967, he sent packages to randomly selected individuals in Omaha and Wichita, Kansas, asking each recipient to forward the package to a named final target in Boston, but only by sending it directly to someone they knew personally, by first name, who might know someone else closer to the target. No recipient could send it to a stranger. Every link in the chain had to be a personal connection. The chains that completed the journey, not all of them did, averaged between 5 and 6 intermediary steps. The phrase that came to summarize the finding, that any two people on Earth are separated by no more than 6 degrees of acquaintance, entered the culture with a speed that suggested people found it not just interesting, but somehow resonant, as if it confirmed a feeling they had already been carrying without a way to name it. The feeling, it turns out, has a corresponding number. The number is smaller than the size of the world suggests it should be. Decades later, the question was revisited with a considerably larger data set. Researchers at the University of Milan analyzed the Facebook social graph in 2011, at a point when the platform had become large enough to function as a meaningful sample of human social connectivity. The average degree of separation between any two users came out at approximately 474, not 6, not 5, less than 5. The world had not gotten smaller between 1967 and 2011. The networks through which it could be traversed had become more visible, and what they revealed was that the actual structure of human connection had always been denser than the apparent size of the population implied. A city of 8 million people sounds like a space in which two specific individuals might never cross paths. The structure of how those 8 million people move through shared corridors, attend overlapping types of events, and circulate through the same transit systems tells a different story. The story is not that meetings are inevitable. It is that the conditions for meetings are richer and more frequently repeated than the raw numbers of a large population suggest. The point where those two lights crossed on the midday mobility map, that Tuesday morning, that intersection, that 5-minute window, was not a singular event. It was one entry in a long unread list. In 2013, a team at Facebook's data science division looked at this from a different angle. They examined users who had listed a romantic relationship on the platform and traced backward through their digital histories before the relationship began. Mutual friends, overlapping event check-ins, locations visited in the same calendar period. What they found was consistent. Most romantic connections did not emerge from encounters between people with no prior overlapping context. They formed within territories that were already, in some degree, shared. The same social clusters, the same neighborhoods, the same recurring locations appearing in both histories before either person had noted the other. The visualization that such an analysis produces, when rendered graphically, has a specific quality. Two separate digital histories, traced independently across months, begin to show common nodes, a mutual friend appearing as a shared point on both networks. A coffee shop check-in, occurring twice in the same month under different accounts. A neighborhood overlapping on the maps of two people who have not yet introduced themselves. The geography of a future acquaintance, forming itself in the data before either person has formed it consciously. The overlapping circles of two lives whose edges have already begun to share territory. This is not in itself an emotional finding, but it is not a cold one either. What it describes is the ordinary richness of a shared city, the fact that people who will eventually matter to each other are usually already circulating within range of each other, already part of the same loose constellation of places and people, long before the specific evening or afternoon when a name is finally exchanged. The distance between any two specific people has statistically always been shorter than it feels. There is something in the birthday problem, in the specific way that the number of possible pairs within a group outpaces the size of the group, that has a texture beyond the mathematics. The surprise is not just that the probability is higher than expected. The surprise is the shape of the reason. Every new person added to the room does not represent a single new chance. They represent as many new chances as there are people already present. The growth is not linear, it is rich, and it accelerates, and the threshold of 50% arrives, as a result, much sooner than the room size suggests it should. Apply that to a life spent in a city, and the picture shifts. Every new place a person frequents is not one new potential overlap. It is an overlap with everyone else who frequents that place, at any of the times that person might arrive, across all the weeks of a year. The accumulation is not dramatic. It is quiet and constant. It runs in the background of every ordinary Tuesday, every routine transit commute, every weekend morning in the same neighborhood park, producing a record of near misses and almost crossings that no one is keeping track of because it does not feel like a record. It feels like a city. It is both. Jung's golden beetle arrived on a day that otherwise followed the pattern of most days in that Kusnacht consulting room, the careful attentiveness of therapeutic listening, the patient describing what the interior had produced in sleep. What marked it as different was not the arrival of the beetle alone, and not the dream alone. It was the specific conjunction, the two events meeting in the same moment, each unremarkable on its own terms, finding a significance in their overlap that neither could have carried individually. Jung spent years afterward thinking about the conditions under which this kind of conjunction felt meaningful rather than incidental, and what distinguished those conditions from simple coincidence, and whether that distinction was psychological or ontological or something that sat between the two. He did not resolve the question. He named it clearly and left it carefully open, which is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that becomes, in retrospect, one of the more interesting things about the 1952 essay. The mobility maps of cities with their thousands of crossing lights are not in dialogue with Jung's beetle. They are addressing something else, the structural frequency of co-presence in shared physical space. But they share a common implication, approached from different distances. The world's population moves through a surprisingly small number of corridors. The network of human acquaintance has a density that the apparent scale of the population obscures. The territory that two people share before they know they share it is typically more extensive than either of them would be able to map from memory. The Tuesday morning crossing, the 2 points of light on the midday mobility map, was not recorded by either person it represented. It left no trace in anyone's diary. In the formal terms of the tracking system that logged it, it was simply 2 data points passing through the same geographic zone in the same short window, one of thousands of such events on that map on that day. The question of what it was in other terms is a different kind of question, and the data does not answer it. The data is interested in frequency. The other question is interested in meaning. Both of those interests are, on their own terms, entirely reasonable. A group of 23 people gathers in a room. The professor writes the number on the board. The probability that 2 of them share a birthday is already, before anyone has checked, better than even. Not because the group was selected for this, not because anything has been arranged, simply because the number of pairs within the group is 253, and the number of days in a year is 365, and when you multiply those 2 quantities against each other in the right way, the result comes out higher than the room size suggests it should. The same multiplication applied to the corridors of a shared city applied to the months of overlapping circulation through the same transit systems and the same neighborhood blocks, applied to the lattice of social connection, whose average depth is less than 5 links across 300 million people, produces an expected frequency of prior co-presence between two people who will eventually meet that is substantially higher than the feeling of coincidence would imply. The feeling is not wrong. It is responding to something real, the specific, particular, unrepeatable fact of this crossing, these two people, this discovered photograph. What the numbers do is place that specific feeling inside a wider frame, and the wider frame is not a diminishment. It is a context. It says this particular crossing was not the only one. It says the territory you shared without knowing was probably larger than the photograph shows. It says the world that produced this was arranged, not by design, but by structure, in a way that made the crossing more likely than it felt. That is not a less interesting thing than the alternative. It is, in its own way, a more interesting one. The 2011 Milan analysis of the Facebook graph found 474 degrees of separation between any two users on a platform that had, by that time, hundreds of millions of active accounts. The number is smaller than the 6 degrees formulation that Milgram's 1967 experiment produced, partly because the dataset was larger and more complete, and partly because the social network being analyzed was global rather than limited to a single country. The world being measured in 2011 included connections that would have been invisible to a 1967 experiment, depending on physical mail. What both experiments measured was the same underlying structure, the specific architecture of how human beings know each other, which turns out to be dense in ways that the simple arithmetic of population size does not predict. A planet of 8 billion people sounds, intuitively, like a space in which any two specific individuals are separated by an enormous distance. The architecture of how those 8 billion people are connected to each other produces a very different picture, one in which the average distance between any two nodes in the network is less than 5 steps. 5 steps across 8 billion people. The world is shaped differently than it appears. The two lights on the midday mobility map continued on their separate paths after the Tuesday morning crossing. The map recorded them moving apart, each one returning to its own side of the city's ordinary geometry, each one absorbed back into the flow of the day's separate routines. The city had no record of the crossing as anything other than a data point. The crossing did not announce itself. It did not leave a mark. What the mathematics suggests is that there were probably other crossings on other Tuesdays in other corridors of that shared city, each one equally unremarked and equally unrecorded in the memories of the two people generating those 2 points of light. The territory of unrecorded nearness, accumulated across months, would have been larger than a single photograph. It would have been larger than a single intersection. It would have been, in the language of the Facebook study, a set of overlapping circles whose edges had been touching quietly for some time before the circles themselves became aware of each other. That is the structure of most connections, examined carefully. Not a singular convergence across an empty distance, but the gradual sharpening of an overlap that was already there, already forming, already accumulating evidence in transit logs and mobility maps and the unremarkable shared geography of a city that channels people into corridors and does not announce when two of those corridors cross. Jung sat with his patient in the still room on Lake Zurich. The beetle arrived. What he wrote about it in the years and decades that followed was not a theory of cause. It was a careful attempt to describe the particular quality of the experience of meaningful coincidence, the feeling that the conjunction carries more than the sum of its parts, that the overlap is not simply arithmetical but significant. He called that quality synchronicity. He did not ask that the word replace the mathematics. He asked only that it describe something the mathematics was not equipped to describe: the felt experience from the inside of two things meeting in a moment that holds more than either could hold alone. The mathematics and the felt experience are describing the same event from different distances. Neither one is wrong. Both are incomplete on their own. The Tuesday morning crossing on the mobility map, the discovered photograph, the overlapping check-ins in the Facebook study, the birthday problem's early arrival at 50%. All of these are different views of the same underlying fact. The world is structured in a way that makes nearness more common than distance. The corridors of a shared city are narrow. The network of human acquaintance is dense. The number of possible pairs within even a small group grows faster than the group itself. And what follows from this is not that coincidence is trivial. What follows is that the fabric of a shared life is woven from a material that is richer and more intricately connected than any single point of light on a mobility map can show. The crossing on the Tuesday morning was one thread. The map contains thousands more that neither person watched arrive. Somewhere in Nebraska, a hand places a letter into the hands of a stranger. The stranger reads the name of the person in Boston it is trying to reach. The stranger thinks for a moment about who they know and who those people might know, and whether the chain that begins with this letter has a link somewhere in their acquaintance that runs toward the right corner of Massachusetts. The world at that moment is being measured, not with instruments, but with the lived structure of human connection, each link tested against the next. The distance from Nebraska to Boston resolving itself not through geography, but through the specific architecture of who knows who, and who they in turn have known. The letter takes 6 steps. It arrives. Milgram counts them. The world turns out to be smaller than it appears, and the distance between any two people who have not yet met is in structural terms shorter than the size of the world would suggest. The corridors of a city channel thousands of paths into shared lanes. The network of acquaintance has a density that the raw population numbers obscure. The number of possible pairs within a group climbs much faster than the group itself. The territory that two people share before they know they share it is typically wider and more frequently visited than either of them has kept track of. None of this is the same as saying that a specific meeting was certain, or that the particular photograph was inevitable, or that any single crossing of two paths on a Tuesday morning was destined to produce anything at all. The mathematics is about frequency, not fate. It describes the richness of the conditions without predicting the outcome. What it says is that the world was, all along, arranged in a way that made nearness a common condition, that the background of an ordinary life is threaded with co-presence that leaves no record, that passes without announcement, that accumulates in silence until the day that a photograph is opened on a kitchen table and a finger traces toward a figure in the background and something begins to be remembered. The letter rests in a stranger's hands in Nebraska. It is heading toward Boston along a chain of 6 ordinary connections, each one a link between people who know each other by name, each one a small span of the denser, closer, more intricately woven world that the distance between two cities makes it easy to forget is there. The hand opens. The letter passes forward. The map continues on its quiet way, thousands of lights moving through the city's corridors, crossing and diverging and crossing again, recording nothing except where they have been, and leaving it at that. A temple courtyard in Taipei holds the evening light a little longer than the streets around it. The walls are hung with red threads, hundreds of them, tied to a wooden lattice by visitors who came at different hours across many years and left something small and specific behind. The oldest threads have faded to the color of dried roses. The newest ones are still vivid, still the particular red of something recently decided. All of them move together in the same slow air that comes off the hills at dusk, barely moving, barely still, the whole lattice breathing in the way that only very patient things can breathe. People have been coming to this courtyard for a long time. They come alone mostly. They stand for a moment before the lattice, and then they tie their thread and leave it, and they go back out into the city, carrying whatever they came with, which is the feeling that some things are connected in ways they cannot see and cannot quite name, but cannot entirely stop believing. The thread stays, the lattice keeps it, and the evenings keep coming, one after the next, the light changing, the threads accumulating, the old ones fading so gradually that no single visitor ever watches it happen. The deity associated with this place is called Yue Lao, which translates in a way that carries its own particular warmth. Old Man under the Moon. He is depicted as elderly, patient, unhurried in the way of someone who has been at a task long enough to know that urgency is not part of it. He carries a book. The book records every union that has been decided. He also carries a cord, and with the cord he ties the ankles of two people who are destined to meet, and then he waits, which is the part of the story that feels most true, the waiting, the long quiet interval between the tying and the meeting, the cord doing its work across whatever distance separates two people who do not yet know each other's names. Temples dedicated to him exist across Taiwan and mainland China, and in the communities that Chinese culture has carried to other parts of the world. Unmarried people visit them still. They purchase symbolic red threads at the entrance, or they bring their own, and they stand before the lattice in the evening, and they tie what they have, and they leave it there. The action is small. The belief underneath it is old. And the two things together, the small action and the old belief, produce something that feels in the doing of it both modest and serious at once. The thread in this tradition belongs to the little finger. It is tied there at the beginning of things, before the people involved have any say in the matter, and it connects two fingers across whatever space and time separates their owners. The thread can stretch, it can tangle, it can loop around the ordinary obstacles that a life contains, the wrong cities, the wrong years, the wrong rooms entered at the wrong moment. But it does not break. That is the part the tradition holds most firmly. The thread does not break. Whatever it takes to keep two people moving toward each other, the thread manages it, quietly, without announcing itself, going about its work in the way that only invisible things can work, which is continuously and without rest. There is something in the image of a cord tied around an ankle or a thread looped around a finger that appears across many cultures and many centuries in different forms, as though the idea of a physical connection between people who have not yet met is one that human beings reach for independently in different languages and different landscapes, because it answers something the mind keeps asking. The asking is consistent. The answers vary in their details, but not in their direction. They all say, in one form or another, that the meeting was not entirely accidental, that something was already underway before the two people arrived at the same place. Across the water and across several centuries, in the libraries and academies of ancient Greece, a playwright named Aristophanes was given a speech to deliver. The setting was a dinner party, the kind that Plato recorded with the specific attention of someone who understood that certain conversations deserved to be kept. The dinner party had a theme, which was love, and each guest was asked to speak on it. When Aristophanes stood and spoke, what he offered was not a definition or a philosophy but a myth, a story about what human beings once were and what happened to them and why they have spent every century since in a particular kind of searching. The original humans, he said, were spherical. They were round and complete, with 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 faces looking in opposite directions, and they moved through the world with a specific confidence that comes from being whole. The gods found this troubling. The round humans were becoming proud, were moving too easily through the world, and so the gods divided them, cut them cleanly in half, left each half with 1 face and 2 arms and 2 legs, and the memory somewhere underneath everything of having once been complete. What Aristophanes described next was the searching, each half moving through the world, looking for the other half, the one that would make the spherical whole again. Plive, in his account, was not an acquisition, but a recognition. It was not finding something new, but returning to something that had always been the case. When 2 halves found each other, what they felt was not surprise, but the particular relief of something clicking back into place after a long time out of position. The word for that feeling in English is recognition. The Greek story makes the etymology feel very literal. This speech was written approximately 385 years before the Common Era began. The text has survived in manuscript copies across more than 2,000 years, carried forward by the hands of scribes who wrote it out, one careful letter at a time, because something in it seemed worth keeping. There is a copy open on a desk somewhere right now, probably, beside a lamp, in the particular quiet of a late night. The passage about the spherical humans has been underlined in copies all over the world by readers who mostly never met each other, who lived in different centuries and spoke different languages, and arrived at that underline from completely different lives. The marginal notes beside it tend to be short. Some of them are just a word. Some of them are simply a mark that means yes, this, exactly this. The feeling that Aristophanes was describing, the feeling of romantic love as recognition rather than discovery, is one that appears in traditions far older than Plato's dinner party, and in places that had no connection to ancient Greece. It is one of the things that seems to arrive independently in cultures that did not share ideas, which is how certain ideas demonstrate that they are reaching towards something real by appearing in too many places to have traveled. In medieval Europe, the belief that love operated as a force with its own direction and its own logic was expressed not in philosophical texts, but in objects. The objects were small and personal and made to be carried or worn. A ring engraved with a name, a knotted thread tied by one person and kept by another, a pendant inscribed with words in Latin or French or English that meant in various formulations that the wearer carried the maker always. A small braid of hair sealed in a locket passed between 2 people as the physical proof of an attachment that words alone could not fully hold. A museum conservator in England holds one of these objects in her gloved palm. The pendant is small. The engraving is worn to the point where certain letters have nearly disappeared, but the ones that remain are still legible, and they still form the fragment of a name. The object is approximately 8 centuries old. It traveled from the hand that made it to the hand that received it, to whatever sequence of hands and containers and archival boxes brought it to this careful moment, and somewhere in that journey, the story of the 2 people it connected was lost, only the object survived. Only the object and the fact of the inscription, which is the fact that someone made this, someone wore it, someone believed that carrying a name was a way of carrying a person. The medieval romance tradition was full of stories about love that operated outside the will of the people it arrived in. Tristan and Isolde loved each other because of a potion or because of fate wearing the costume of a potion. The stories vary on this point, but what they agree on is that the love was not chosen, not decided, not the result of deliberation. It arrived. It had its own force and its own direction, and it did not particularly consult the people it was happening to. The moral weight of these stories was not always straightforward, but the emotional architecture was consistent. Love as something that came from beyond the individual, something that found its people rather than being built by them. What the medieval tradition was doing with these stories was the same thing Aristophanes was doing at Plato's dinner party, and the same thing the priests of Yuelao were doing in the temple courtyards, providing a frame, a way of organizing a feeling that otherwise resists organization. The feeling is the one that arrives when something that should be new feels inexplicably familiar, when a stranger's face carries the weight of something already known, when a meeting feels less like a beginning than like a continuation of something that had no beginning either of them can locate. The frame says, this is what that is. There is a name for this. There is a tradition for this. You are not the first person to feel it, and there is a story that has been waiting to hold it for you. Not every tradition reaches for the same kind of frame. In many indigenous North American cultures, the understanding of romantic connection as something spiritually prepared before the physical encounter takes a different shape, one that is less about invisible chords and more about the landscape of the interior, the visions and dreams and animal visitors that move through a person's awareness in the years before something important arrives. In the oral literatures of these traditions, a partnership is sometimes announced in advance, not announced loudly, not with certainty, but in the way that the world sometimes offers a hint of what is coming to those who are quiet enough and attentive enough to receive it. A young woman sits in the long grass on the northern plains as the afternoon light begins to change. The gold of midday has shifted toward the first pale blue of evening. She is not waiting for any specific thing. She is waiting in the more open sense, the sense that involves setting aside the ordinary noise of plans and expectations and becoming simply present in a particular place at a particular hour. In the oral traditions that describe this kind of waiting, what arrives during it is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is an animal that pauses on its way through and holds still for a moment longer than animals usually do. Sometimes it is a particular quality of light. Sometimes it is a dream that comes that night and carries with it the specific texture of something that will later be recognized. The young woman in the grass does not know what is coming. She knows, in the way these traditions teach their members to know things, that something is already in motion, that the preparation has been underway longer than she has been aware of it, and that the awareness itself is part of the preparation. What is consistent across these stories? The plains, the temple in Taipei, the Greek dinner party, the medieval pendant, is not the specific belief, but the specific feeling the belief is trying to hold. The feeling that a meeting between two people, when it finally happens, is not entirely fresh, that something has been accumulating, that the two people were not, in some sense, that is difficult to articulate, but easy to feel, complete strangers, that the introduction was more like a confirmation of something the world had been arranging, quietly and without announcing itself, for longer than either person knew. The Chinese tradition of the red thread is the one that gives this feeling its most vivid image, the thread around the little finger, the book that records all unions, the old man under the moon, patient enough to wait through however long the distance requires. The idea that two people can live in different cities, in different circumstances, moving through completely different days, and still be connected by something that is doing its work, whether they know about it or not. There are temples across Taiwan where the lattice walls have been accumulating threads for long enough that the oldest layers have become something like texture rather than individual threads. They are not distinct anymore. They have pressed together and faded together and become part of the wall, the way that any accumulation of something small and numerous and patient eventually becomes its own kind of structure. The new threads arrive and are tied and are vivid for a while, and then the light works on them and the weather works on them, and they slowly become part of the whole. The larger thing that all of them together make, which is the record of everyone who came here and stood before this lattice and believed or wanted to believe, or simply did not know what else to do with the feeling that something was connected that they could not see. Aristophanes finished his speech at the dinner party, and the other guests listened, and Plato listened, and then the evening continued in the way that evenings do, moving toward whatever came next. The speech was recorded, the recording was copied, the copy was copied again, across 2 millennia of human hands, until it arrived in the form it takes now, on library shelves and open laptops, and in the small hours of mornings when someone cannot sleep and finds themselves reading about spherical humans and the particular mercy of reunion, and the idea that love is not a beginning, but a return. The object in the conservator's gloved hand is returned to its case. The case is closed. The pendant rests in the dark, in the way that old objects rest, without urgency, without need, with the particular patience of things that have already outlasted everything they were made in. Somewhere, in some archive not yet opened, there may be a record that connects the name on the pendant to a person, to a story, to a meeting that happened 8 centuries ago, and felt to the people in it like something that had already been decided. That record has not been found. It may never be found. The pendant continues without it, quiet in its case, holding what it holds. The young woman on the northern plains sits until the light has fully changed. The blue of evening is complete now, the last of the gold gone, the first stars beginning to show in the east. Whatever she was waiting to feel, she has felt it, or she will feel it, or the feeling will come later in a dream, arriving with the kind of calm certainty that certain things carry. She stands. The grass moves around her as she moves. She walks back toward the lights that mean home, carrying the quiet weight of something she does not yet have words for, but that already feels, in the way that the tradition she was raised in taught her to recognize these things, like the beginning of a recognition. The red thread tradition says that the cord can tangle. This is one of its most useful features, this acknowledgement that the path between two people is not always straight. The cord, in the course of doing its work, passes through the complicated geography of 2 separate lives, the years spent in wrong cities, the relationships that were almost right, the meetings that happened at the wrong time, and therefore did not take. All of this is the tangle. None of it breaks the cord. The cord simply gathers the tangle in and keeps going, because the cord does not have an opinion about how long this should take or how direct the route should be. The cord has only one concern, which is the eventual arrival, and on that point it is entirely patient. There is a quality in the oldest traditions, the ones that have been carried through enough generations to have worn smooth in the handling, of not being surprised by difficulty. Aristophanes did not say that the halves find each other quickly. The story of the spherical humans does not specify a timeline. Yuelao's book does not record estimated dates of arrival. The oral traditions of the northern plains do not promise that the vision will come on any particular night. What they offer instead is something more reliable than a timeline, which is a context, a frame within which the distance between two people and the time it takes to close that distance is not a failure or an error, but simply part of the nature of the thing. The cord is long because life is wide. The searching goes on for as long as it goes on because human lives are complicated and the world is large, and two people can spend years moving through the same general territory without ever occupying the same corner of it at the same moment that the other one is present and paying attention. What every one of these traditions is doing, in its particular way, is offering comfort to the feeling that a meeting was a long time coming, the feeling that something was being prepared, the feeling that the introduction, when it finally came, arrived with a weight that introductions between complete strangers do not usually carry, a weight that comes from somewhere further back than the moment of first contact, from some accumulation that happened in the time before, in the years of nearly crossing paths and almost shared spaces, and all the occasions when two people were present in the same general vicinity without knowing it. The morning after a long overnight rain, a temple courtyard in Taipei holds puddles between the stones. The red threads on the lattice are darker with water, vivid in a different way than they are when dry. A few visitors come early, before the main part of the day. They stand before the lattice, and they tie what they have brought, and the small, quiet act of tying a thread to a lattice wall is the same act that has been performed in this place for generations, by people who came with the same feeling, in the same posture, the feeling of carrying something they could not resolve on their own, and offering it to a tradition older and more patient than any single life. Yuelao is still keeping his book in the way that the traditions maintain him. The book is very long. It has been added to for a very long time. Every entry is a union, a pair of names connected by a cord that was tied at the ankles when neither person knew it was being tied, and then allowed to do its work across whatever intervening geography and history separated the two names. The old man under the moon does not rush the entries. He makes them with the deliberateness of someone who understands that the arrival, when it comes, is certain, and that certainty does not require speed. There is a medieval love token in a museum in London that carries an inscription in Old French. The inscription is a fragment. The full text was longer, but the surface has worn, and what remains is only part of what was said. What remains is enough to indicate affection, enough to confirm that this object was made with intention, and given with intention, and kept with care by whoever received it. The person who made it has been unknown for centuries. The person who received it has been unknown for centuries. The meeting between them, the meeting that made the object worth making, is a fact that survives only in the object itself, in the thing that was created because two people knew each other, and one of them wanted the other to carry that knowing wherever they went. The object persists in the way that objects persist, which is without effort, without memory, without any awareness of how much time has passed. It simply is. It holds what was put into it. And what was put into it all those centuries ago was the specific gravity of a connection between two people who felt in the way that people feel these things, and always have felt them, that what was between them was not entirely of their own making, that it had arrived as something already in progress, that meeting each other was a kind of completion rather than a kind of beginning. Aristophanes' spherical humans, split apart by the gods, spent their lives not searching for something new, but searching for the specific thing they had lost, the specific wholeness they remembered in the part of themselves that lives below memory, in whatever deeper layer holds the knowledge of what it felt like to be complete. The reunion, when it came, was not the building of something from nothing. It was the return of something that had always existed, the reassembly of two pieces of a thing that had been one thing before. Either piece had a name. The image Plato gave that story, or the image Aristophanes gave it and Plato recorded, has lasted for more than 2,000 years. It has lasted because the feeling it describes is recognizable. Every person who has read the speech and written yes in the margin, or underlined the passage in pencil, or simply paused and held the book still for a moment before turning the page, every one of them was recognizing something. Not the spherical humans, which are a story, something underneath the story. The feeling that a particular meeting was not in any ordinary sense a meeting of strangers, that something in the geography of two lives had been converging long before the moment of introduction, that the introduction was simply the point at which the convergence became visible. The red thread does not announce itself. This is one of the things the tradition is careful to say. It is tied at the beginning of things, before either person is aware of it, and then it simply continues, doing its invisible work. Two people can live entire decades without knowing the thread is there. They can move through their lives at what seems like a completely unconnected distance. The thread holds anyway. It persists in the way that invisible things persist, which is by simply not stopping, by continuing its single task without requiring that anyone notice it, or acknowledge it, or believe in it. In a temple in Taiwan, the lattice of red threads sways in the evening air. The light is going now, the blue deepening toward the color of the sky just before the first stars, the threads moving together in the small wind that comes off the hills as the day closes. Some of the threads are tied in careful knots. Some of them are tied in the faster, less deliberate way of people who came with the specific emotion rather than the specific technique, who arrived at this lattice with something to say, and found that tying the thread was how to say it. All of them are here. All of them are moving together in the same slow way. The old ones and the new ones, the faded and the vivid, the patient and the recent. Across traditions that never spoke to each other, across centuries that had no correspondence, across landscapes as different as the northern plains and the Greek islands and the narrow streets of medieval European cities. People have been arriving at the same image, the connection that precedes the meeting. The cord that was tied before the tying was known, the half that was always the answer to a question. The other half did not know how to ask.